Hi guys, tonight, before the world fully quiets and the hours stretch thin, I want to invite you into a story that begins with a river doing something it was never meant to do, stopping mid-flow, as if time itself had hesitated and held its breath. This is a tale whispered by frost and moonlight, where an ordinary village discovers how fragile routine can be and how silence can carry both fear and hope. If you're listening from the U.S., maybe it's late at night and the house is finally still. If you're in Europe, perhaps it's near midnight or just past it. And if you're somewhere else in the world listening in the early hours before dawn, know that you're not alone in this quiet moment. Wherever you are, I gently invite you to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Tell us where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Now take a moment to get comfortable. Let your shoulders relax. Let the day loosen its grip. Allow your breathing to slow as we return to the story, letting it unfold gently, like a dream you don't need to rush. The village woke without knowing anything had changed. Doors opened softly, boots pressed into familiar paths, and thin smoke rose from chimneys in slow, lazy threads. The air carried the pale chill of early winter, not yet cruel, just sharp enough to make breaths visible, blooming and fading like fleeting thoughts. The river had always been the first sound of morning, a low, patient murmur flowing past the edge of the village, steady as a heartbeat. But on this morning, there was no murmur, no whisper of water over stone, only a strange, padded quiet, as if the world had been wrapped in thick cloth. At the riverbank, frost clung to the reeds like delicate white feathers. The surface of the water lay smooth and pale, frozen not from the edges inward, but all at once, as though an unseen hand had pressed pause in the middle of a sentence. Beneath the ice, shapes of trapped current, twisted and curled, suspended in glassy stillness. Bubbles hung like pearls, mid-rise, never reaching the surface. Villagers gathered slowly, drawn by instinct before understanding. No one spoke at first. The silence felt heavy but not hostile, more like a question waiting to be answered. Children stood close to their parents, feeling the cold seep through boots and coats, while elders leaned on worn canes, eyes narrowed in thought rather than fear. The river had always given them life. It fed the fields, turned the mill wheel, carried reflections of sky and season. Seeing it stopped felt like seeing a trusted friend suddenly asleep, unmoving, breath uncertain. Yet the ice did not crack or groan. It held firm, calm, almost gentle in its stillness. A thin wind moved through the village, carrying the scent of snow that had not yet fallen. Somewhere a bell chimed the hour, its sound traveling farther than usual in the quiet. And in that stretched moment, the villagers felt it together, a soft unease paired with a quieter hope that whatever had paused the river might also be teaching them how to wait. The day continued, slowly, carefully, as if everyone feared moving too fast might break something unseen. As the morning wore on, the village seemed to move more softly, as though sound itself had become fragile. Footsteps slowed, voices stayed low, wrapped in scarves of caution. Even the dogs, usually eager to bark at passing shadows, lay curled near doorways, ears flicking, but bodies still. The frozen river remained unchanged. Sunlight climbed higher, brushing the ice with a faint silver glow, yet nothing melted, nothing shifted. The trapped water beneath looked almost alive, shaped into gentle curves and quiet swirls, a memory of motion preserved in cold clarity. It was beautiful in a way that made the heart ache. like seeing something familiar made distant. Inside the mill, the great wheel stood useless, its wooden paddles stiff with frost. The miller rested his hand against the rough beams, feeling the cold seep into his palm. He did not curse or panic. Instead, he closed his eyes and listened, hoping to hear even the faintest hint of water trying to move. There was only silence, deep and wide. In kitchens across the village, pots were set to simmer. Bread dough was kneaded slowly, and children were given small tasks to keep their hands warm. The smell of herbs and wood smoke drifted through narrow streets, grounding everyone in the comfort of routine. It was as if the village itself had decided to keep breathing normally even while the river slept. Elders gathered near the square, sharing memories in murmured tones, winters harsher than this, storms that had tested roofs and resolve. Their voices carried calm rather than fear, reminding the younger ones that stillness did not always mean danger. Sometimes it was simply a pause. By afternoon, the sky softened into pale gray, and snow finally began to fall. Each flake landed soundlessly on the frozen surface, adding to the quiet rather than breaking it. The river disappeared beneath a thin white veil, no longer glassy, now hidden like a thought tucked away for later. As evening approached, lamps were lit one by one, their warm glow reflecting faintly on the snow. The village settled into itself, waiting, not anxiously, but attentively, like someone sitting beside a sleeping friend, trusting that breath would return in its own time. Night arrived gently, without ceremony. The sky deepened from gray to indigo, and the first stars appeared like quiet promises, scattered carefully across the dark. The cold sharpened, yet it did not bite. It simply reminded everyone that winter was drawing closer, step by patient step. Lanterns glowed behind frosted windows, their light soft and golden, spilling onto the snow in trembling rectangles. Inside, families gathered close. Stories were told in hushed voices, not to fill the silence, but to keep it company. The frozen river lay just beyond the village edge, unseen now, but felt, its stillness pressing lightly against every thought. Outside, the ice responded to the deepening cold with faint, distant sounds, not cracks of breaking, but long, low sighs that traveled beneath the surface, like the river dreaming of movement. Those awake in the night paused when they heard it, holding their breath, then relaxing when the ice remained whole. A young watchman walked the riverbank, his steps careful, his lantern swinging slowly. The snow muffled everything, and the world felt wrapped in sleep. He crouched once, pressing his gloved hand to the ice. It was solid, calm, unyielding, and yet beneath it the water's shape hinted at patience rather than defeat. The river was not gone. It was waiting. Above, the moon rose pale and full, casting a soft sheen across the frozen surface. For a moment, the river looked like a road of light leading away from the village, promising that stillness could also be a kind of guidance. The watchman straightened, comforted by the quiet strength of it. As midnight passed, the village slept. Breath rose and fell in darkened rooms. Dreams came slowly, touched by images of water and snow, of time paused but not ended. The river remained frozen, holding the night gently in its grasp. Before dawn, the cold eased just enough to be felt rather than measured. It was subtle, a loosening at the edges of the night, a softness in the air that brushed the skin and then moved on. Those who woke early sensed it without knowing why, turning in their beds, listening more closely than usual. At the riverbank, the ice did not break. It did not crack or shift, but beneath it something changed. The shapes frozen mid-swirl seemed to blur slightly, as if memory itself had stirred. Tiny threads of movement traced along the underside of the ice, so faint they could be mistaken for tricks of moonlight fading into morning. A woman fetching water from a well paused, bucket hanging from her hands. She tilted her head, listening. There it was, not the river's old song, not yet, but a whisper, thin as breath through teeth. It came and went, uncertain, like someone testing their voice after a long silence. The sky lightened slowly, turning from deep blue to soft ash. Frost sparkled on rooftops and fences, and the village emerged from sleep one careful step at a time. When people returned to the river, they stood farther back than before, respectful, attentive. No one spoke above a murmur. A child pointed first. Near the center of the frozen surface, a faint dark line traced its way forward, not a crack, but a shadow of movement below. The ice remained whole, yet the water beneath pressed gently, reminding the village that flow had not been forgotten. Hope arrived quietly, without celebration. It settled into chests like warmth spreading through cold fingers, slow, deliberate, undeniable. The river was still trapped, yes, but it was no longer entirely still, and in that almost motion, the village felt time begin to move again. By mid-morning, the village had learned a new rhythm. It was slower than before, shaped by observation rather than habit. People returned to their tasks, but with frequent pauses, moments to listen, to look toward the river, to feel the air against their cheeks as if it might offer answers. The frozen surface reflected the pale sky, calm and unbroken. Yet beneath it, the water no longer felt like a memory, it felt present. A faint trembling passed through the ice now and then, not enough to frighten, just enough to be noticed. Each time it happened, conversations fell quiet and then resumed, softer than before. Near the edge of the river, someone set down a bench, worn smooth by years of use. It became a place to sit and watch, to rest without expectation. Elders wrapped in thick coats shared the bench with children who swung their legs, counting breaths, counting seconds. No one hurried them away. The miller adjusted his routine, turning to repairs he had long postponed. The baker kneaded dough more slowly, letting time do its work. Even the animals seemed to understand, moving with an unspoken care, hooves and paws pressing gently into snow. The day passed without dramatic change, and yet it felt full. Waiting was no longer empty. It had become something active, almost purposeful. The village was learning to exist within the pause, to trust that not all progress announced itself loudly. As evening returned, the river remained frozen, but the air carried less tension than the night before. Lamps were lit again, meals were shared, and the quiet no longer felt heavy. It felt patient, like the village itself, learning to wait alongside the river. That night the temperature shifted once more, not warmer, not colder, but balanced, as though the world had found a careful center. Snow clouds thinned, revealing a sky brushed with distant stars. Their light settled gently over the village, turning roofs and paths into soft outlines rather than sharp edges. Near the river, the ice responded with a sound few had ever heard before. It was not a crack or a break, but a long, flowing hum, low and steady, like a note held on a string. Those awake paused, hands still, hearts attentive. The sound rose and fell, carrying a strange comfort, as if the river were humming to itself. Beneath the ice, movement grew more confident. The frozen curves softened, and the trap bubbles shifted just enough to prove that time had not been lost, only delayed. The river seemed to remember its own shape, its own way of traveling forward without haste. A man walking home stopped at the bank, lantern light trembling across the ice. He smiled without realizing it. The sound did not promise a sudden release, but it promised continuity. The river had not forgotten how to be a river. Back in their homes, people slept more deeply than they had since the freeze began. Dreams came warm and slow, filled with images of water, moving through reeds, of spring remembered even as winter held on. The river remained frozen by morning, but its silence was gone. In its place was a quiet music just below hearing, carrying the village gently through the night. Morning arrived wrapped in a soft mist, the kind that blurs edges and encourages patience. The village emerged slowly, as if not to disturb the fragile balance the night had shaped. Breath no longer stung the lungs, it simply drifted upward, pale and calm. At the riverbank, the ice looked the same at first glance, smooth, pale, unbroken. But those who had been watching closely noticed the change. Near the edges, where reeds leaned inward, the ice had thinned just enough to darken. Water pressed closer to the surface, its presence more felt than seen. No one rushed forward. The village had learned restraint. Children were guided gently back, hands held, voices soft. The river was awake now, and waking things deserved space. Sunlight filtered through the mist, touching the ice in shifting patterns. Where it lingered, the surface grew slightly dull, losing its glass-like shine. A drop of meltwater formed, then another, sliding slowly across the frozen skin before disappearing into a shallow groove. The miller returned to the river and listened. Beneath the thinning ice, the hum had changed, still low, still calm, but layered now, like water clearing its throat before speaking. It was not a promise of immediacy, only of inevitability. By afternoon, the village felt lighter. The fear that had never fully taken hold now loosened its grip entirely. The river was still trapped, yes, but gently, temporarily, and with a clear path back to motion. As the day leaned toward evening, the light grew longer and softer, stretching across the snow like a careful hand, smoothing a blanket. Shadows moved slowly, unhurried, and the village followed their pace without thinking. Near the center of the river, a sound traveled outward, a quiet, deliberate line forming beneath the ice. It was not sharp, not violent. It was a seam, thin as a thread, tracing its way across the frozen surface. Those watching felt their chests tighten for a moment, then ease. The ice did not split apart, it simply acknowledged the pressure beneath it. The seam darkened slightly, revealing the slow patience of water below. Tiny ripples pressed upward, then settled, as if the river were testing the space it had been given. The ice answered by holding, not resisting, but allowing just enough. Villagers stood together along the bank, coats brushing, breaths aligned. No one spoke. There was no need. The moment felt complete on its own, quiet proof that change did not have to arrive suddenly to be real. A bird crossed overhead, its wings whispering against the cooling air. Somewhere, a door closed gently. Life continued in small, careful motions, weaving itself around the river's gradual return. As dusk settled in, the seam remained unchanged, yet unmistakable. A mark of transition, a reminder that even the strongest stillness could learn how to open, slowly, kindly, without breaking. That night, the village did not watch the river as closely. not because it mattered less, but because trust had begun to take root. The kind of trust that allows the body to rest while the mind lets go, knowing that not everything requires constant attention. Windows were shuttered against the cold and lamps were turned low. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of soup and baked grain. People spoke of ordinary things again, of repairs to be made in spring, of seeds waiting in storage, of journeys postponed but not canceled. Outside, the river rested beneath its ice, the seam faintly visible even in moonlight. Beneath it, water flowed in small, careful paths, moving without urgency. The sound it made was barely there, more felt than heard, like a heartbeat against the ear. A watchman passed once along the bank, then turned back early, satisfied. The river no longer felt like something to guard against. It felt like something to accompany. Snow fell lightly in the early hours, dusting the seam until it nearly vanished. But the village knew it was there. Change did not need to be visible to continue. By morning, the world felt quieter, not with tension, but with acceptance. The village had learned that waiting could soften into trust, and trust could make even the longest pause feel gentle. Morning returned like a slow breath, drawn after sleep. The sky was pale and open, washed clean by the night snowfall. Roofs gleamed softly, and the village stirred without urgency, as if everyone had agreed, without words, to begin the day gently. At the river the ice still held, but it no longer felt dominant. Beneath it, water moved with quiet confidence. The seam from the day before had softened, blurred by frost and snow. Yet the subtle darkening beneath the surface told its own story. Flow had found a way, thin and patient, threading itself forward. Someone knelt at the bank and brushed snow away with a gloved hand. The ice was cool but not harsh, firm but not defiant. When the wind passed, the surface responded with a faint tremor, like a sigh answered by another sigh beneath. The village listened while going about its morning tasks. Buckets filled at wells, fires were coaxed awake, doors opened and closed with care. The river's presence wove through everything, not loud, not demanding, simply there, steady and reassuring. By midday, sunlight touched the ice again, and tiny beads of water formed along the edges, catching the light before slipping away. No one cheered. No one rushed closer. The moment did not need witnesses to be meaningful. The river was still trapped, yes, but now it carried itself like something moving forward even while held. And the village, sensing this quiet determination, moved with it. The afternoon unfolded without sharp edges. Clouds drifted lazily, thinning and thickening in no particular order, and the light that reached the village felt filtered, forgiving. Time seemed to stretch, not dragging, but opening, wide enough for small moments to settle comfortably inside it. Along the river bank, the ice had taken on a muted tone, less reflective than before. It absorbed the light instead of returning it, as though listening. Beneath the surface, the water's movement was steadier now, no longer tentative. It flowed in narrow paths, finding room where it could, pressing gently, never insisting. A pair of children sat on a fallen log nearby, swinging their legs slowly. They spoke in whispers, not because they were told to, but because the place seemed to ask for it. Every so often, one of them leaned forward, watching the ice with curious eyes, sensing that something important was happening, even if they couldn't name it. In the village, tasks blended into one another. A pot was stirred, then left alone. A fence was mended, one careful knot at a time. No one worked to finish, they worked to continue. The rhythm felt kind. As the sun lowered, warmth lingered longer than expected. The ice responded with a soft, almost musical creak. Not a warning, not a break, but an adjustment. The river accepted it, flowing on beneath, patient and persistent. When evening finally arrived, it did so gently, like a hand resting on a shoulder. The village welcomed it without concern. The river was still frozen, still holding its pause, but the pause no longer felt like being trapped. It felt like becoming. Night returned with a softer step than before, as if it, too, had learned the village's new way of arriving. The cold did not deepen, it settled. Snow on the ground reflected the moonlight, turning darkness into something gentle and navigable, like a familiar room dimmed for rest. By the river, the ice held its place, calm and patient. Yet beneath it, the current had grown more assured. Water slid through narrow channels with a smooth persistence, polishing its path one invisible inch at a time. The sound it made was subtle, so subtle it seemed imagined, but those who paused long enough could feel it in their chests, a steady rhythm matching their breath. A thin mist hovered just above the frozen surface, rising where warmth met cold. It moved slowly, drifting like a thought that didn't need to be finished. Lantern light from the village caught in it briefly, then let it go. Inside their homes, people slept deeply. Dreams came without urgency, unfolding in wide, calm scenes, fields waiting under snow, rivers moving beneath ice, patience rewarded without spectacle. Even those who woke in the night did not worry. They listened, felt the quiet, and returned to rest. The river did not rush. It did not demand release. It simply continued, certain that time, when met gently, always opens. Morning light arrived pale and deliberate, spreading across the village as if it had all the time in the world. The air carried a hint of dampness now, subtle but unmistakable, the scent of water beginning to reassert itself after days of cold restraint. At the riverbank, the ice showed its quiet labor. The darkened areas beneath had widened not dramatically, but enough to notice if you were looking with care. The water's path had grown broader, its movement more confident. The ice, still whole, bowed to this persistence, thinning in places where it could give without breaking. Villagers gathered again, though less out of concern and more out of companionship. They stood shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in coats, sharing the warmth of presence. Someone poured tea into small cups, steam curling upward, blending with the faint mist rising from the ice. A low, smooth sound traveled along the river's length, a gentle slide, like fabric drawn across wood. It carried no alarm. It was the sound of progress made slowly and well. The miller returned once more, listening with a practiced ear. He nodded, not to anyone in particular, but to the river itself. It was finding its way back not by force, but by understanding the shape of what held it. By midday, sunlight lingered longer on the ice, and thin rivulets of meltwater traced quiet lines across its surface. They vanished as quickly as they formed, slipping back into the river's patient hands. The path beneath the ice had widened, and with it, the village felt something else widen too, a sense that movement, once begun, carries its own gentle momentum. The sound came back slowly, almost shyly, as though it wasn't sure it would be welcomed. It began as a soft murmur beneath the ice, so faint it could easily be mistaken for wind brushing reeds or snow settling into itself. But those who paused long enough recognized it, the river remembering how to speak. The village listened while going about their day. The murmur wove itself into everything. The scrape of a chair across a floor, the clink of a cup being set down, the sigh of a door closing. It didn't interrupt life, it accompanied it. At the riverbank, the ice seemed to breathe. It rose and fell in nearly imperceptible motions, adjusting to the steady insistence beneath. The dark channels under the surface connected now, forming a quiet network of flow. The river was no longer moving in fragments. It was moving as itself. Children laughed nearby, their voices light and unafraid. The sound carried farther than before, floating easily through the open air. No one hushed them. Joy, too, had found room again. As afternoon warmed, a thin line of open water appeared near the far bend of the river where the current had always been strongest. It shimmered briefly, catching the light, then widened just enough to show motion without revealing depth. The river had not fully returned, but its voice had. And in hearing it, the village felt reassured, reminded that even after the deepest pause, familiar sounds can find their way back. By the next morning, the place where the river curved away from the village had changed. The ice there had loosened its hold, retreating just enough to reveal a narrow ribbon of open water. It flowed quietly, unhurried, dark, and smooth, against the pale edges of frost. No one hurried toward it. The village had learned the value of distance, of letting change happen without crowding it. People observed from the bank, hands tucked into sleeves, breaths slow and even. The open water carried reflections again, muted sky, drifting clouds, the faint outline of bare branches reaching outward. Seeing those reflections stirred something gentle in the chest, like recognizing a familiar face after a long absence. Upstream, the ice remained firm but thinner, responding to the river's renewed strength. The murmur beneath it had grown steadier, a low, continuous sound that seemed to anchor the day. The miller smiled as he passed the bend, already planning when the wheel might turn again. Not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but soon enough to trust. As the sun climbed, the open water widened slightly, catching more light, moving a little faster. The river did not rush its return. It unfolded, one quiet success at a time. With open water now visible, the village's breath seemed to deepen, shoulders relaxed. Movements became a little less careful, a little more natural. The pause that had held everything gently in place was beginning to release its grip. The river's sound carried farther each hour, threading through the village streets like a memory returning to its proper place. It did not dominate the air, it simply filled it, steady and reassuring. At the riverbank, the ice nearest the village softened, turning opaque, its edges rounding. Meltwater pooled briefly, then slipped away, joining the current below. The river accepted it without comment, weaving it back into its flow. People lingered outside longer now. Conversations stretched. Laughter returned in easy waves rather than cautious bursts. Even the wind felt different, less sharp, more companionable. As evening came, the river continued its quiet work, opening space where it could, resting where it needed to. The village followed its lead, learning that recovery, like rest, happens best when unforced. The morning carried a sense of anticipation so soft it could have been mistaken for calm. Frost still glazed the ground, but the air held a gentler promise, as if the cold had learned to step aside when asked politely. At the mill, the wheel stood ready, its paddles damp where meltwater had reached them during the night. The miller arrived early, not to rush the moment, but to be present for it. He rested a hand against the wood, feeling the faint vibration traveling up from the river. Downstream, the open water had widened again. The current moved steadily now, no longer threading itself through narrow paths, but flowing with quiet confidence. Ice broke away in small, harmless pieces, drifting a short distance before melting back into the hole. The miller adjusted a lever slowly. The wheel resisted at first, then yielded, not suddenly, but with a deep, patient creak. One paddle dipped into moving water, then another. The wheel turned just a fraction, then again. No cheer went up. The moment did not ask for noise. It was enough to watch the wheel find its rhythm again, matching the river's pace, neither pushing nor lagging behind. By midday, the mill was working gently, grain passing through stone with a familiar, soothing sound. The village heard it and smiled. The river had returned not with force, but with purpose restored. The day warmed in small, careful steps. Sunlight lingered on the river longer now, touching the ice until it thinned and softened. Along the edges, small pieces broke free, not with noise or violence, but with a quiet release, like hands unclasping after a long hold. Each piece drifted briefly, turning slowly in the current before dissolving back into water. The river carried them without effort, without memory of being trapped. It moved forward as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Villagers watched from a respectful distance, wrapped in coats that were now worn open. The air felt damp and alive, carrying the scent of earth beneath snow. Even the ground seemed to be waking, preparing for what would come next. Children pointed as ice slipped away, their excitement contained, gentle. Elders nodded, recognizing the familiar rhythm of thaw and return. No one hurried the process. The river had taught them better. By evening, long stretches of open water reflected the sky again. The ice that remained did not fight its end. It thinned, accepted, and slowly let go. By morning, the river had reclaimed much of its surface. Where ice once held the world in stillness, water now moved freely, carrying reflections that shifted with every breath of wind. Clouds slid across the surface, stretching and reforming, reminding the village that motion had returned not just to the river, but to time itself. People paused at the bank longer than necessary, watching reflections ripple and change. Seeing the sky move in the water felt grounding, like placing a familiar object back where it belonged. The river's voice was clear now, a steady, gentle flow that neither rushed nor hesitated. The remaining ice clung only to shaded edges, thin and translucent. It no longer felt like a barrier, just a lingering memory of the pause that had been. Meltwater traced quiet paths along the bank, darkening soil and feeding roots that waited patiently beneath. Life resumed its fuller rhythm. The mill worked steadily. Paths grew busier. Yet the village carried something new with it, a softness, a shared understanding that even when everything stops, it does not mean it is lost. As afternoon light shimmered across the water, the river flowed on, reflections dancing easily in its grasp, carrying the village forward with it. The river no longer looked frozen at a glance. Only in quiet corners where shadow lingered and sunlight arrived late did thin sheets of ice remain, clinging gently to stones and reeds. They caught the light like fragile glass, beautiful but temporary, waiting for their moment to disappear. The village moved easily now. Doors opened wider, voices carried farther. The sound of water blended back into daily life so naturally it felt as though it had never been gone. And yet everyone knew something had changed, not in the river, but in themselves. People lingered more often. They sat by the water without purpose, just to listen. The pause the river had forced upon them had left space behind, and in that space attention had grown. Small things were noticed again, the way sunlight broke on ripples, the soft pull of current around stones, the calm certainty of flow returning on its own terms. Children tossed small sticks into the river and watched them drift, not racing, not competing, just following. Elders smiled at this, seeing in it the lesson the river had given freely. Movement does not need urgency to be meaningful. As evening settled, the river carried the last traces of ice away, smoothing the surface into something whole again. The pause was over, but its echo remained, woven quietly into the village's rhythm. Evening came softly, as it had learned to do. The sky dimmed into warm shades of blue and gray, and the river reflected them without interruption, its surface calm and unbroken. The sound of water moving over stones was steady now, familiar, like a sentence finally finished after a long pause. The village did not retreat indoors as quickly as before. People lingered by doorways, leaning against frames, watching the river darken as night approached. There was no need to check on it constantly anymore. Trust had taken root deep and quiet. Lanterns were lit, their reflections stretching and wavering across the water. Each ripple bent the light gently, reminding everyone that movement could be soft and still carry strength. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, comforting and full. A couple walked slowly along the bank, their footsteps unhurried. They spoke about nothing important and everything important all at once. The river listened, carrying their voices away without judgment. When darkness finally settled, it did so without tension. The river flowed on, steady and sure, and the village rested beside it, no longer afraid of silence, no longer startled by stillness. Night returned, but it was a different kind of night now, one that moved instead of pressing down. The stars reflected clearly in the river's surface, stretching and trembling with each gentle current, as if the sky itself were drifting downstream. The air cooled, but it no longer felt sharp. It wrapped the village in a quiet clarity, making every sound distinct and meaningful. The river's voice carried farther in the stillness, a low, continuous hush that seemed to smooth the edges of thought. People paused when they heard it, not out of concern but out of appreciation. In their homes, windows were left slightly open. The sound of flowing water slipped inside, threading through sleep like a soft melody. Dreams followed its rhythm, unbroken, unhurried, full of wide spaces and steady movement. Along the bank, the last thin traces of ice loosened and vanished without notice. No one marked the moment. The river did not announce it. It simply continued, whole again, carrying the night forward. By the time midnight passed, the village slept deeply. The river flowed beside it, awake and attentive, reminding everyone, without words, that even after stillness, movement knows how to return. Morning arrived with a gentle certainty, as if it had always known how this would end. The sky opened in soft layers of pale gold and cool blue, and the river greeted the light with an easy, unbroken flow. No ice remained to catch the sun, only water, moving calmly, confidently, as though the pause had been a long breath now fully released. The village woke to familiar sounds restored, water over stones, the slow turning of the mill, birds calling from bare branches along the bank. These sounds did not startle anyone. They settled into the day like something that had merely stepped away and returned. People stepped outside without coats for the first time in days, feeling the damp air brush their skin. The river smelled alive again, fresh, clean, carrying hints of earth and distant places upstream. Watching it move felt grounding, like watching time itself behave properly again. Children played near the water under careful eyes, skipping stones that bounced and disappeared into the current. Each ripple spread outward, then vanished, leaving the surface smooth once more. The village did not celebrate. It didn't need to. The river had come back quietly, and so life followed. The thaw had passed, but its lesson lingered gently, like warmth left behind after sunlight moves on. As the day unfolded, the river carried something new along with its steady flow. Not debris, not ice, but a sense of quiet generosity. The water ran clearer than before, as if the pause had given it time to settle, to remember itself fully. Along the banks, soil darkened and softened. Small channels formed where meltwater had soaked in, feeding roots that had waited patiently beneath the frost. The land seemed to respond with gratitude, holding the moisture carefully, preparing for growth still weeks away. Villagers noticed how easily the river moved now, how smoothly it accepted stones and bends without resistance. It felt wiser somehow, not changed in shape, but in presence. The pause had not weakened it. It had refined it. People filled buckets again, washed hands in the cold, clean water, and felt a quiet reassurance in the simple act. The river was reliable, yes, but it was also generous, offering what it had without needing to be asked. By afternoon, sunlight shimmered across the surface, breaking into countless moving fragments. Watching them felt like receiving something unearned and kind. The river flowed on, carrying its gift forward, leaving the village calmer than it had been before the freeze. That evening, as the light thinned and the river took on deeper tones, the village felt a new kind of quiet, one that did not come from absence but from fullness. The water moved steadily, yet it left behind a calm that settled into walls, paths, and hearts. People sat longer with one another, words came slowly, chosen with care, and silences no longer felt like gaps to be filled. The pause the river had once enforced had taught them how to listen, to water, to wind, to one another. Along the bank, stones newly revealed by the thaw gleamed dark and smooth. They had been shaped quietly, over time, by pressure and patience. The river flowed over them without struggle, knowing their contours now. As night approached, the village lights reflected in the water, wavering gently. Each reflection stretched, broke, and reformed, never lost, only changing shape. Watching them felt like watching memory itself, fluid, forgiving, always moving forward. The river no longer needed attention. It did not need watching or waiting. Yet the village lingered beside it anyway, not out of fear, but out of gratitude for the stillness that had come and for what it had left behind. The following day unfolded without event, and that in itself felt remarkable. The river flowed as it always had, steady and unremarkable to an outside eye, yet the village moved through the day with a quiet awareness that something subtle but lasting had been gained. Strength revealed itself differently now. It was not in how quickly tasks were finished or how loudly plans were made. It showed itself in patience, in the way people paused before speaking, in how they watched the sky before deciding when to plant, in how they allowed moments to remain incomplete. The river mirrored this strength perfectly. It moved around obstacles instead of against them, smoothing stone rather than breaking it. Its flow was calm but persistent, a reminder that endurance does not need force to be effective. As afternoon warmed, villagers worked along the banks, clearing branches left behind by the thaw. They did so slowly, together, sharing tools without hurry. Laughter came easily, not sharp or sudden, but warm and low. When evening arrived, the river carried the day away without ceremony. It flowed on, and the village, stronger in ways it could not fully name, flowed with it. The days that followed slipped into one another without clear edges, marked more by light than by clocks. Morning arrived earlier now, and the sun lingered just a little longer in the afternoon, warming the river's surface until it shimmered softly. Along the banks, the first hints of green began to appear, so small they could be missed if you weren't looking for them. Thin blades pushed up through darkened soil, fed by the water the river had held so carefully during its pause. Growth came without announcement. The village noticed these signs in passing. Someone bent to touch a leaf. Someone else smiled and said nothing. Life was returning, not all at once, but in layers, each one gentle and sure. The river flowed steadily through it all, carrying reflections of sky, branches, and birds that had begun to return. Its voice remained calm, unbroken, a constant thread running through the turning season. By evening, the air held more warmth than cold. People sat outside without thinking to count the minutes. The river moved beside them, unchanged on the surface, yet deeply connected to everything now beginning again. Even as the days grew milder, the village carried a gentle memory of cold, not as discomfort, but as understanding. The river flowed freely now, yet sometimes in the early morning a thin mist hovered above it, echoing the shape of the ice that had once held everything still. People noticed how the river sounded different at dawn, not louder or softer, but rounder somehow, as if its voice had learned depth. Standing on the bank, one could feel that the water remembered the pause, even as it moved on without regret. Along the edges, stones once hidden by ice lay exposed, their surfaces smoothed by time and patience. Children traced their shapes with curious fingers, feeling the quiet work of seasons layered into each curve. Nothing had been wasted, not the stillness, not the waiting. In the village, routines continued with an easy grace. Work was done, meals were shared, and evenings stretched long enough to feel generous. The river moved beside it all, carrying the memory of ice like a lesson folded neatly away. As night settled, stars reflected cleanly in the water. The village slept without fear, knowing now that even when motion stops, it does not disappear. It waits, gathers itself, and returns, calm, whole, and ready. By now the river's flow felt so natural that it was easy to forget the days when it had been held in silence. And yet something in the village had shifted in a way that did not fade. People moved through their days with a gentler awareness, as though each step had learned to listen before landing. The river taught without speaking. It showed how stopping did not mean failing, how stillness could be part of motion rather than its opposite. Watching it curve around stones, the villagers understood that resistance was not always strength, and patience was not weakness. In small moments, the lesson appeared. Someone paused before answering, choosing kindness over speed. Someone else rested instead of pushing through exhaustion. Even disagreements softened more quickly, carried away by an unspoken understanding that time could smooth most things. At dusk, the river caught the fading light and held it briefly, turning the surface into a slow-moving ribbon of copper and blue. The water carried the day onward, just as it always had, but now the village carried something too, a quiet trust in the rhythm of things. As night approached, the sound of the river blended seamlessly with the world around it. Nothing needed fixing, nothing needed rushing. The lesson had settled, deep and calm, like water finding its level. The days ahead no longer felt uncertain. They stretched forward like the river itself, clear, patient, and quietly assured. Morning light arrived with ease, and the village met it without tension, trusting the gentle continuity that had returned. Along the riverbank, paths softened where people walked more slowly now. Footprints lingered a little longer in damp soil, then faded, leaving the ground smooth again. The river mirrored this rhythm perfectly, carrying traces of the present without clinging to them. Plans were made but loosely. Fields would be planted when the soil was ready, not before. Repairs would happen when hands were rested enough to do them well. The village no longer pushed time forward, it moved alongside it. In the evenings, the river caught the sky's changing colors and carried them downstream, blending past and future into a single, flowing moment. Watching it felt like watching reassurance made visible. The freeze had passed, but what followed was not simply a return, it was an unfolding, a future shaped by patience, held together by trust, and guided gently by the steady flow beside them. One afternoon, when the light hung softly between seasons, the river seemed to settle into a deeper calm. It flowed as it always had, yet there was a sense of rest within the movement itself, like a body breathing steadily after a long walk, neither tired nor hurried. The village noticed it without pointing it out. People paused along the bank, not to check on the water, but to feel that balance, the way motion and stillness could exist together without conflict. Leaves drifted on the surface, turning slowly, carried along without urgency, without resistance. The sound of the river had become a constant again, but not a loud one. It threaded gently through daily life, present even when unnoticed. In its rhythm there was room for thought, for silence, for small joys that did not demand attention. As the sun lowered, the water darkened and smoothed, reflecting only hints of sky. The river flowed on, untroubled, holding within it the memory of ice, the patience of thaw, and the certainty of continuation. The village stood beside it, understanding now that rest does not always mean stopping, and that sometimes the deepest calm is found inside steady movement. There came a day when silence returned to the village, not the heavy quiet of uncertainty, but a full, rounded stillness that felt complete. The river flowed steadily, yet its sound blended so perfectly with the air that it seemed to disappear, leaving behind a sense of calm rather than absence. People noticed how easily they could sit without speaking now. Benches along the riverbank were used not for watching, but for resting. Hands folded, eyes softened. The world did not need commentary to feel alive. The water moved past stones that no longer interrupted it. Instead, they shaped its song into something smooth and low, a sound that felt more like feeling than hearing. The river was no longer a thing to think about. It was a presence to lean into. In the village, time stretched kindly. Meals lasted longer. Walks ended when they felt complete, not when they were planned to. The pause the river had once enforced had taught everyone how to let moments finish on their own. As evening settled, the sky dimmed without drama. The river reflected it faintly, then let it go. Silence filled the space between breaths, and for the first time, no one mistook it for emptiness. As the weeks moved on, the river slipped gently into the background of village life, not forgotten, but woven so completely into the days that it no longer stood apart. Its flow marked time without announcing it, like a clock that did not tick, only breathed. People crossed the small bridge without stopping as often. Children ran ahead, laughter trailing behind them, feet thudding lightly on worn planks. The river listened and carried the sound away, smoothing it into the larger hush of moving water. Along the banks, grasses grew thicker, bending easily when the current brushed close after rain. Birds returned to familiar stones, dipping and lifting in quick, confident motions. Everything behaved as though the pause had always been part of the story, not an interruption, but a chapter that fit exactly where it belonged. The village felt steady now, not busy, not rushed, just steady. Days opened and closed with a natural ease, guided quietly by the flow beside them. Even when clouds gathered or winds shifted, there was a sense that balance would return, just as it had before. At dusk, the river caught the last light and let it scatter. No one stood to watch. No one needed to. The river had become what it had always been meant to be, not a problem to solve, but a presence that allowed life to move gently forward. The days softened further, rounding themselves at the edges. Mornings arrived with birdsong and thin light, evenings settled with long shadows and the slow cooling of air. The river kept its steady pace, neither swelling nor shrinking, carrying the village through each cycle without comment. At night, windows were left open again. The river's sound slipped inside like a familiar breath, steady enough to soothe, quiet enough to let sleep deepen. Dreams grew simpler, wide fields, open paths, water moving without obstacle. Waking felt easy, unforced. People began to notice how their bodies responded to this gentleness. Shoulders stayed relaxed, steps landed more quietly. Even worries, when they appeared, seemed to float rather than sink, carried along by the same unseen current. Along the riverbank, lanterns reflected in the water during evening walks. Their light stretched and blurred, then reformed, never breaking. Watching them felt like watching time itself, flexible, forgiving, always continuing. Nothing remarkable happened on those days, and that was their gift. The river flowed. The village rested within that flow. And in the quiet exchange between water and land, life found a rhythm that asked for nothing more. Eventually, the story of the frozen river shifted its place in the village. It moved from something people talked about into something they remembered quietly, like a long winter recalled without cold. The days no longer carried echoes of worry, only a calm awareness that stillness, when it comes, can be lived through. The river flowed on, unchanged to the eye, yet in certain moments, early morning or just before dusk, it seemed to slow its voice, as if honoring what had been. The water slipped around stones with a softer sound, and the surface held reflections a heartbeat longer before letting them pass. Villagers felt this in themselves. When unexpected pauses appeared in life, a delay, a silence, a waiting, they met them differently now. There was less tension in the waiting, more trust in what might follow. The river had taught them that movement does not vanish, it gathers. As twilight settled, the water darkened and smoothed, carrying the day away without haste. Lights appeared one by one along the shore, their reflections stretching and folding back into the current. The pause had become memory, and the memory had become strength. There came a stretch of days when time itself seemed to soften, as if it had learned the village's new pace. Hours passed without pressing, and mornings did not rush toward noon. The river flowed through it all with an easy assurance, carrying the sense that nothing important was being left behind. People noticed how quickly calm returned after small disruptions, a sudden rain, a missed meeting, an unexpected quiet. Where impatience might once have grown, now there was space. The river had shown them that delays could be held gently, that waiting did not have to bruise the heart. Along the banks, the water slid past stones that were newly polished, their surfaces dark and smooth. Sunlight skimmed across them, then drifted on. The river did not cling to brightness or shadow. It accepted both and moved forward, unchanged. In the evenings, conversations slowed. Words found their places more carefully. Silences rested comfortably between sentences, like pauses in a song that made the melody clearer. The river's sound threaded beneath it all, steady and forgiving. Time felt kind then, not because it moved faster, but because it moved well. And beside the river, the village learned to trust that kindness, letting days unfold as they wished. The river had become more than a feature of the landscape. It was a companion now, present without demanding attention, reliable without needing praise. Its flow marked the days quietly, a gentle presence that people felt even when they did not look toward it. When someone walked alone along the bank, the river seemed to walk with them, matching pace, offering a sound that neither interrupted thought nor allowed it to drift too far. The water moved steadily, reminding each passerby that they were not separate from the rhythm carrying everything forward. Children played nearby, no longer warned to keep back except out of habit. They understood the river instinctively now, sensing where it was calm, where it asked for care. Their laughter floated over the water and was carried downstream, softened but not lost. At sunset, the river reflected the sky's final colors, muted golds, fading blues, then released them as night approached. The village watched sometimes, and sometimes did not. The river did not mind either way. It flowed beside them as a companion does, quietly, faithfully, sharing the work of carrying days forward, one calm moment at a time. Calm took on a shape the village could recognize now. It lived in the way mornings opened without hurry, and in how evenings closed themselves gently, like a book set down with care. The river carried this calm effortlessly, shaping it with each bend and ripple, making it visible without ever naming it. On quiet afternoons, people rested near the bank, eyes half closed, listening to the water pass. The sound no longer asked to be heard. It simply existed, steady and reassuring. Thoughts drifted like leaves on the surface, arriving, turning once or twice, then moving on without weight. The land around the river responded in small ways. Grass leaned toward the water, stones warmed and cooled with the day. Even shadows seemed softer, stretching without urgency, retreating without regret. Everything felt allowed to be as it was. As twilight settled, the river darkened and smoothed, holding the last light just long enough to feel complete before letting it go. The village breathed with it, slow and even, comforted by the knowledge that calm was not something to chase. It was something to notice. Night arrived like a familiar shawl laid gently over the village. The air cooled without bite, and the river's surface darkened into a soft mirror that held the stars briefly before letting them drift downstream. The sound of water was steady and low, a lullaby that did not repeat itself exactly, yet never changed its promise. Houses settled into rest, lamps dimmed, footsteps faded. Along the bank the river carried the night with a calm assurance, smoothing small disturbances as they appeared, an eddy forming and dissolving, a leaf turning once and then slipping on. Nothing lingered too long, nothing was hurried away. Those still awake felt the comfort of being accompanied. The river did not watch, did not judge. It simply flowed, making room for thoughts to quiet themselves. Breaths slowed, shoulders loosened. The world felt held, not by stillness, but by a movement so gentle it could cradle sleep. As midnight passed, clouds thinned and the stars brightened. Their reflections stretched and softened in the water, then broke apart and rejoined, teaching the same lesson again without words. Continuity does not require perfection, only patience. The village slept. The river carried the night onward, steady and kind, preparing the quiet path toward morning. Morning returned as it always did, without announcement. Light slipped gently across the village, touching roofs, paths, and finally the river itself. The water accepted the day with ease, flowing on as if it had never known pause, even while holding the memory of it deep within. The village woke slowly. Doors opened. Breath met air. The river's sound threaded through it all, steady, calm, complete. It no longer marked change or recovery. It simply was, carrying everything forward without needing to be noticed. Standing at the bank, one could see how nothing had been lost. The river had not been weakened by stopping, nor the village by waiting. Both had learned something quiet and enduring, that life does not always move in straight lines, and stillness is sometimes part of the journey rather than the end of it. Water curved around stones and disappeared into the distance, promising continuation without urgency. The river flowed, the village lived, and time moved gently between them, unbroken. The river that once froze mid-flow now carried the village onward, not as a force, but as a companion, always moving, always patient, always enough. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me and for letting this story flow gently beside you. Wherever you're listening, from the U.S., Europe, or somewhere else in the world, and whatever hour has found you, I hope the calm of this river stays with you as you rest. If the story brought you peace, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, allow your thoughts to drift like water, your breathing to slow, and your rest to come easily. The river will keep flowing, and you can sleep peacefully beside it,